Shalom Aleichem and welcome to Mochain La'ira online smicha. If last week we made a short halachic video about the discussion about which haftarah to say, and it was different opinions, this upcoming Shabbos Chazoin, Parshas Dvarim, Erev Tisha B'Av, has a lot of halachic complications, how to deal with and different minhagim. But let's start with the Gemara in Tainus. The Gemara in Tainus of Chavtes Amud Aleph says, Oisa Yom Shecharav Abayis, the day that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Tisha B'Av Haya, it was Taka the 9th of Av, U'Motzoi Shabbos Haya. And it was a Motzoi Shabbos. So this is exactly the Kvias of this year, is the Kvias of the Churban Bayis. So it takes a special importance. The Gemara says, in Erev and Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, the Gemara says like this. Usually we know that on Erev Tisha B'Av, we downgrade and we get closer and closer to Tisha B'Av. The Avelis intensifies, and there are certain things that we don't even do on Erev Tisha B'Av as preparing for Tisha B'Av. But when Erev Tisha B'Av falls out in Shabbos, this all goes out of the window. And the Lashon HaShulchan Aruch, the Lashon HaGemara in Erev and Daf Mem Aleph is Afal Pi she'erev Tisha B'Av ein oichlin shnei tavshilin. Even though in Erev Tisha B'Av usually when it comes towards the end of the day, we're doing the Sudas and Mafseket, you're not even supposed to eat shnei tavshilin, two dishes together. It has to be an introduction meal to the morning. Nevertheless, Imchol b'Shabbos, if Erev Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos like this year, Maila al Shulchanai, he brings food on the table as much. Afilu kisudas shloima b'shaitai. You could eat and bring to the table as much as Shloima Melech b'shaitai in its time. Now I want to tell you what some Mefarshim are medayik and Sifrei Chassidus the medayik and all these words. Maila al Shulchani, bring it onto your table. Says, why don't you say Eichel? And afilu kisuda shloima is a description. Shloima Melech was the wisest, the smartest, the richest. So I'm sure his meals were very luxurious. But we find something very interesting that Reb Tzadok HaKohen asks, if you want to describe a luxurious meal, there is in the Torah mentioned somebody who had even a nicer, a greater meal than Shloima Melech. And that was Avraham Avinu. Shlomo Melech, of course, when he had to support his whole family and give food to everybody around him, he had to make a big meal. But Avraham Avinu only was serving 1 or 2 or 3 guests. And when the guests came to him, the Urchin came to him, the three Malachim, he served them a feast l'roiv. So why doesn't he describe it with Avraham Avinu? And I'll give you his answer in a minute, and I think it has a big nafkamina la'alacha too. It plays a role in nafkamina la'alacha. Another question is, what does he mean when he says b'shaitai? Shloim kesudas shloima b'shaitai, in its time. So let's bits and pieces. Ma'ila al shulchanai, you bring it up to your table. So I saw in one of the Chassidish Svarim it says that we know that Mizman Beis Hamikdash, the Mizbeach was mechaper. The karbanos that were brought on the Mizbeach, that's where atoned for any sins. Today's days we're Nebuch, we don't have a Beis Hamikdash. The shulchan shel adam mechaper, the way you behave and the way you do, the way you eat properly, and everything you do on serving guests, poor people, inviting them to the table, that's what causes the kapara. Or in Chassidish Svarim it says the skabrus, the overpowering on your taivus, and just eating what you're supposed to eat, and just don't living a life of luxury, even on the shulchan, that's mechaper. So Maila al Shulchani means to say that even though we don't have a Mizbeach now, but the Shulchan that we're going to do, whatever we're going to do by the Shulchan, by our table, will be as a replacement to the Mizbeach and the Beis Hamikdash. So there's a very famous interpretation here from Rav Meir Shapiro, because typically we seem to interpret this as a symbol of riches. So we say, Shlomo Melech in his prime, he must have had great festivities, great meals. That's how much food you're allowed to eat. But Meir Shapiro actually says it, no. B'shaita means in his downtime. The Gemara says in Maseches Gittin Daf Samach Amud Beis, the Gemara says that for a period of time, Shlomo HaMelech was uprooted from his leadership, and he was wandering around, and he lost his leadership. So much so, he was walking around telling people, Ani Shlomo, I'm King Shlomo, and nobody believed him. Nobody remembered who he was. And referring to that time, Shlomo HaMelech said the famous pasuk, Ma Yisrael la'adam b'chol ha'amolei sheyamol tachas hashemesh. What do you gain from all your toil, your work? It goes away like nothing. People forget that you are a king. Referring to that time. Anyway, so Shlomo HaMelech was the Melech, and with the story with Ashmedai, he was uprooted from being a Melech for some time, and eventually Chazal Malchus, he became a king again. So Meir Shapiro says, what it means over here when it says Kesuda Shlomo b'Shaitai is actually talking about Shlomo HaMelech as he was eating b'Shaitai in his downtime, and because even though it was in his downtime, he knew that eventually he's getting it back. He never gave up. He was never miyayish. So the same thing, Klal Yisrael, even though now we are in a Maimon Matzav that we're missing the Beis HaMikdash, but we are so positive, we're so sure, so confident it's going to come back, the way Shlomo HaMelech felt b'Shaitai. The Pnei Menachem from Ger, he actually said a similar pshat. He says, just like Shlomo HaMelech, even though he knew that there's a gzeira against him, that he has to be a hedyot, that there has to be some time that he's going to lose it all, nevertheless, the time when he was living as a king, he lived all out like a king. So too, every Yid in Erev Tisha B'Av, if it's Erev Tisha B'Av falls out in Shabbos, even though we know that tonight you're never going to have to celebrate, you're going to have to act Tisha B'Av, but when it's Shabbos, you live a Shabbos-tic life as if like Shlomo HaMelech lived as a king, knowing that there's going to be a time he's going to lose it. Incidentally, there's a story that Naftali Meropshitz, when Shabbos fell, when Erev Tisha B'Av fell in Shabbos, he was Meirich in the Shalosh Shudas, and he would say, Shabbos Kodesh. Stay with us a little longer. It's difficult to part from Shabbos. Tisha B'Av, you're knocking on the door. Wait outside. Halavai, we don't have to get you to come. And that's the approach. Right now it's Erev Shabbos. Right now it's Shabbos. It's Erev Tisha B'Av. You live a Shabbos life. So that becomes a shaila that becomes a difficult halacha in many cases. Number one, we just spoke about the eating on Shabbos. So Shulchan Aruch says, Ma'ila al shulchani afilu kesuda shleima b'eis malchusay. Right? The Mishnah Brura in Siman Tov Kuf Nun Beis Sif Yud Sif Katan Chav Gimel brings from the Magen Avram that even though you're allowed to eat a festive meal, you should still not eat with many people together. He should eat b'davar nefesh, a little broken-hearted. However, the Bechor Shur, he argues and says, if anybody usually eats with guests on Shabbos, and this Shabbos he's going to eat alone, it's going to be avelis b'farashia. Morning on Shabbos, you're not allowed to do that. Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Igros Kodesh, Eir Chaim Chelik Dalet Siman Kuf Yud Beis Ois Aleph, he goes a step further. He says, even somebody who doesn't usually have guests on a regular Shabbos, but just like he's allowed to eat meat and drink wine on this Erev Tisha B'Av, and it doesn't make a difference if it's somebody who eats meat and wine usually, so too, this Erev Tisha B'Av, you're allowed to have guests, even if usually you don't have guests. So we see that it's not only in the amount of people you have, it's not only the type of food, how much food you're allowed to have, even people. That leads us to the other question, to answer the other question. Before I ask, why did he describe it with Shlomo HaMelech b'Shaitai? Why wasn't it Avram Avinu? Avram Avinu had a much greater meal because he served all that for 3 people. And in other words, Shlomo HaMelech had many people. Avram Avinu had maybe more food, but for a smaller amount of people. And the diuk perhaps over here is, you could even act like Shlomo with groups of people. Even somebody who doesn't have so many guests on Shabbos, this Shabbos you're allowed to have a festive meal and many, many, many people. All right, so now in Shulchan Aruch it goes on to another question. Are you allowed to learn Erev Tisha B'Av A regular Erev Tisha B'Av Achar Chatzos, you don't learn. Why? Because Torah makes you happy, and if it makes you happy, it's going to roll into Tisha B'Av, because you don't forget it right away. And Tisha B'Av, you'll still have the happy mode. And so the question is, what happens on a Erev Tisha B'Av Shechol Lias B'Shabbos? So the Ramah actually says, that in this Erev Tisha B'Av, and Siman Tov Kufin and Gimel Siv Beis, he says, Noagu, Shalai Lilmay Erev Tisha B'Av Mechatzos Ve'elech. The custom is that in Erev Tisha B'Av, from a half day on, you don't learn only the things that you're allowed to learn in Tisha B'Av. And therefore, if it falls out on Shabbos, like this year, you will not say Pirkei Avos. So this year, we won't say Pirkei Avos. Please go out. You won't say Pirkei Avos. Last week we said Perek Beis. We'll skip over, and next week we'll say Perek Gimel. So there's a machlekes. There's actually different opinions. If you're allowed to learn, you're not allowed to learn this year, because l'chayr, by food you said you could do whatever you want. It's as if it doesn't exist. And L'Poil, the Ramah says that you only learn this Erev Tisha B'Av, even though it's Shabbos, only things that would be a regular Tisha B'Av. Another halacha that comes about is usually you're supposed to minimize the things, the luxurious clothing that you wear, that it shouldn't, on Tisha B'Av, you're not supposed to wear fancy clothing because it's never a sign of Avelus, right? So the question becomes, this year, where Tisha B'Av gets rolled in from Shabbos, and Shabbos you're not wearing jeans, and Shabbos you're wearing special clothing anyway, Shabbos to your clothing. Do you have to take off the clothing before Tisha B'Av enters, Motzei Shabbos, as we see by the shoes? We see that by the shoes we take off either before Baruch Hu or after the Baruch Hu, however the custom is, before Ma'ariv on Motzei Shabbos, during Ma'ariv Motzei Shabbos, because it's starting Tisha B'Av. So what about the rest of the clothing? Do you have to change the Shabbos clothes? Do you have to change the Shabbos clothes Motzei Shabbos before you say Kinus and Eicha? So regarding this, we find different opinions. We say, like, first of all, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he, whenever it happened Motzei Shabbos, he came to shul to daven Motzei Shabbos with Tisha B'Av shoes, but the Shabbos clothes, obviously it was after Shabbos already, and Shabbos and the Shabbos clothes he would wear even during Kinus, during Eicha by night. Other opinions held, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach held that since those who wear, the discussion is even in Shabbos Chazoin. There are people who are even in Shabbos Chazoin don't wear Shabbos clothes. But since many of us on Shabbos Chazoin, just like we eat and it's festive, we don't change it. We don't change our clothing. We keep the regular Shabbos clothing for Shabbos Chazoin. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, however, held that it's just like you change your shoes before you say Kinus and Eicha on Motzei Shabbos, so too you change your Shabbos clothes and you don't wear Shabbos clothing for the Kinus and Eicha. Some want to say that there's a difference between obvious Shabbos clothing like a shtreimel. Those who wear a shtreimel Shabbos, they only wear it in Shabbos. They don't wear it in any other time. So it maybe makes sense to change it, not to make it, to make it obvious the difference. But for those who, like Shabbos clothes is very similar, just cleaner, then not necessarily you have to change it.